Good morning, everybody, and welcome to week 5 of our readings for the Forensic Psychology course. I probably get overexcited about most of our research papers, but I'm going to go ahead and give the broad statement that this one's my favourite, which I believe I also said in week 3, but this one is definitely the favourite. I think from this paper, it's not just that it's a theoretical innovation, and it's not just the impact of the paper and what it says, but it's a methodological innovation. And I think to have the data that this paper has with regards to the area that it's studying, in the time in which it is being studied, in my honest opinion, I think it is really exciting. Now, you may have noticed this by now, and we should probably address this head on. At this point, we've seen the name Laurence Alison a couple times. Some of you may think of me kind of at the moment basically being kind of Laurence Alison by proxy and just parroting his work back to you. There are reasons for that, but I mean, well, let's be frank. Firstly, Laurence Alison is my PhD supervisor, mentor, and probably my closest collaborator, so I'm biased. But also, Laurence Alison, about a month ago, was awarded an MBE, which, for those of you who don't know, is a member of the British Empire. It's one of our top awards in the country for the work that he did in response to the COVID pandemic. So I don't just attach myself to him out of a kind of a legacy piece. He is, in my opinion, the most impactful forensic psychologist. And you should, I hope, see that from the fact that his name popped up throughout the profiling work, throughout the Rachel Nickel case, and now as we go into the interrogation work, you're seeing his name there again. So it's kind of whenever forensic psychology is in the thick of it, you'll see Lawrence's name. So that's kind of why he's there. And also, in my opinion, his work is just better than all the other stuff that we see. So let's dig into this paper, right? Why tough tactics fail and rapport gets results. Observing rapport-based interview techniques, brackets orbit, to generate useful information from terrorists. And if anyone is really interested by this paper, I can recommend to you a new book, Orbit, The Science of Rapport-Based Interviewing for Law Enforcement, Security and Military, by Laurence Alison, Emily Allison, Neil D. Shortland, that's me, and Francis Sermon Boer. So really a shameless plug, and to be honest, I wouldn't buy it unless you're going to take a course on interrogation. But there we go, new book out now. Discount codes are available. It makes for fantastic Christmas gifts. So let's start with a story. All right, okay. So here we are, and we're looking at this idea of interrogating terrorists. And from last week's lecture, you should kind of know where we're at with the Shane O'Mara reading, right? This idea that it's kind of the Wild West, and kind of everyone's kind of putting things together in the background, right? Mitchell and Jensen are coming up with their wild idea, and there are all these claims about effectiveness, and one of the problems in something like interrogation, and this is an issue that we see in that we saw in the profiling world as well, is very hard to disprove the claim that it's effective, because when it comes to something like interrogation, it's very hard to actually prove anything, to build a scientific study of it. So because the couple ways you can do it is, one, you can basically just listen to people and they can give you their kind of autobiographical perception. We've seen some of the issues with that. The other is you can do the kind of the psychological model, right? This idea of kind of doing a psychological experiment. I know many of you are criminologists in this course. Many of you are psychologists, and many of you come from different fields afar. But what you'll know if you're a psychologist is that there's a very classic way in which we do studies, and that is that we recruit undergraduate psychology students in exchange for mandatory course credits, and we ask them to come in and be parts of our studies, right? And in this area, Albert Vrij is kind of the pioneer of this work, in which he brings a student in and he'll ask them to do something or read something, and maybe then he'll ask them to lie. And he'll ask someone else to interview them, and he'll measure, he does a lot of this work on lie detection, which we have coming up in the near future. And he'll use that to kind of measure different tactics. Now, it's good, and it's a really good way of controlling for an experiment, and it's a good way of developing data in the absence of real world data. But sometimes some of the problems with that is we have to remember who the participants are. And I always remember as a as a young undergraduate psychology student, doing my due diligence and being part of studies. And, the research study would say, don't eat for 24 hours because we're studying, hunger on cognition. And I'd tick the box and say, absolutely. And then, I'd wake up that morning and remember that I was doing a research study, turn up, they'd say, have you eaten for the last 24 hours? And I'd say, oh, no, I haven't eaten at all. The honest truth is I was probably wolfing down a burger and chips at 3 a.m. and I woke up after 2 hours sleep. But, they didn't need to know that because then I wouldn't have got my credits. So undergraduate students are quite a unreliable sample at times, I think we'll say. And I don't think psychology solved that, to be honest. But it gives you this kind of interesting ultimatum of, well, if I can't study it in the real world, well, how do I study it at all? And that's why this paper, and specifically the work that stemmed from it, is so impactful, because as I'll show you, the data that they got actually allows the scientific and the kind of the experimental almost study of interrogation behaviours. So if we're going to go into the introduction, apparently it flips to 2 pages now, that's exciting. What Laurence is basically saying is that if you look historically, there is this issue that we are now interrogating a lot of very, very senior Al-Qaeda, IRA, terrorist members. And from the police standpoint, he talks about the PACE approach here. Basically, there are these ways that we've constructed interviews. And basically what he kind of says is that the idea of rapport isn't particularly well conceptualized. Sometimes it's viewed as almost a stage. And I think in the slides I'll probably end up showing you, there's this research of kind of, police officers, how do you define rapport? Well, I define rapport as, asking them what their favourite soccer team is. So how would I build rapport with you? Well, I'd turn up and, I'd say, hi, how's everyone doing? Oh, yeah, Tom Brady. Sorry, everyone, I had to take a quick break there. My phone decided to blow up and ruin my entire screen. Okay, so what the police concepts say is basically this idea that rapport is almost a stage. It's a tick box, right? So you go in, you say hello, you build rapport, and then you move on with your interview. And what Laurence is basically saying is that is not a very good interpretation of what rapport is. Rapport is not a stage, it is an underlying fabric of an interaction. And really, if appropriately done, rapport should allow you to actually be kind of, it allows you the opportunity to be almost, ask harder questions and stuff. And so he talks to basically the idea that there is a philosophical difference in the idea that rapport is a soft tactic. Do you want a cup of tea? How's your mother? Versus rapport is a kind of an overarching concept that enshrines the entire interrogation. So as we move on to page 412, 413, and we will cover this more in class, what Laurence is basically talking about, because this video I really want to focus on the methods. What Laurence is really talking about here is basically how he decided to define rapport in the orbit model, so observing rapport-based interview techniques. And he basically says that rapport stems from 2 perceptions. One is motivational interviewing, and one is the interpersonal behavioural circle. In brief, and again we will cover these in detail in class, in brief, motivational interviewing is basically the idea, it's a therapeutic idea from Miller and Rolnick that's been used in therapy kind of since the early 1970s. And it's the idea that you can't make somebody do something. And it's this idea that, and then there's a really good quote that I'll track down and read to you. But basically Miller and Rolnick said basically, if you're dealing with a drunkard, you can't make him stop drinking, and you can't control the environment and wear him down to the point where he accepts that he needs to stop drinking and he stops drinking. The only way he will stop drinking is if he decides that he should stop drinking. Now you can help him, you can nudge him, you can gently kind of gently try and tip the scales, but you don't have the control to make him do something. And that's at the heart of this approach. It's that you as the interrogator cannot make somebody talk. All you can do is accept that they can decide to talk, and you can try and tip the scales, help them come to that realization, but the underlying autonomy of all of this lies in the person. And the interpersonal behavioral circle is basically this idea that different people present with different types of personalities, and that the personality dyad, i.e. you and the other person, is going to interact, it's going to impact what the rapport in that interaction is like. I have a very good example I'll give you. I'm moderately extrovert. I control conversations. I can happily talk over people. However, when I talk to my best friend, he might be the only person that's better at that than me, and I become very submissive. And he talks for 85% of our phone calls. And what you're seeing there is that the rapport is dependent on how you react to the other person. And to be very, very broadly conceptual here, what Laurence kind of says is if someone's being super dominating, in order to build rapport, you basically need to be kind of mild-mannered and meek. And if someone's being mild-mannered and meek, to build rapport, you need to be you need to exert control. Someone has to be exerting control. So that's what the interpersonal behavioural circle is. And again, as he points out here, it's kind of a 1950s psychological theory. So what's going on here, and I think is really interesting, is while we're talking about interrogation in a post 9/11 world, theoretically, Laurence is talking about the 50s and 60s and 70s and kind of old school psychological concepts that he's packaged into this kind of orbit model. So let's take what we've got here very briefly, right? Laurence has a model, okay? He says that you need to have good interpersonal behavioural skills, our interpersonal behavioural circle, and you basically need to evidence what he calls motivational interviewing techniques, which are these kind of very rapport therapeutic approaches, right? So that's his model. And what he's saying is that if these behaviours are used, then you are going to get more information from a detainee. Now, there are two papers that I won't do a video for both. They're very, very similar, but the dependent variable is different. One is on yield, so the idea of information given, and one is on counter-interrogation techniques, so them basically actively resisting you. And these papers are basically sisters of each other. In this paper, we're looking at how much they tell you, and in the other paper, we're looking at how much they actively resist you. And Laurence's hypothesis is that if you do this kind of orbit model approach, you will increase the amount of yield, i.e. the amount of information, and you will decrease the amount of counter-interrogation techniques. Now, while they are separate, in my opinion, that those two things kind of come together. But now let's look at the data. So you can see it in his hypothesis. I don't need to bore you with those. Now let's look at the data. The study included 418 audio and video recordings of police interviews with 29 terrorist suspects, brackets representing 288 hours of footage, who were subsequently convicted of terrorism-related offences. So already, from a data standpoint, we have the largest database ever collected and analysed of real interrogations by the police. So these are their internal videotapes that they have recorded as part of the legal process of interrogating somebody, and they are with terrorist suspects. Now, obviously these are not air quotes now black site CIA interrogations and the kind of things that I would say the enhanced interrogation techniques were used on overseas, but these are. From a US-centric perspective here, these are your Dzhokhar Tsarnaevs, okay? These are your Timothy McVeighs, if you want. These are your Omar Mateen's, your any terrorist that convicts an act of terrorism. This would be the interrogations with them in the minutes, days, months after the terrorist attack. Nicholas Cruz would be another example that I'm not sure if he's in this sample, but he would be a candidate for this. So that's the level of the data. And as you can imagine, if before that you had A, nothing, or B, undergraduate students being interviewed by undergraduate students, this already shows a kind of a data leap in terms of the validity of what we're looking at here. Now, to get into the procedure, I think that's another really interesting and important step, because what Laurence has this framework, right? This analysis framework of tick boxing these behaviours and quantitatively coding them. And I'm not going to go through the entire thing, but if you are interested, on page 417, table 3, this is kind of the the kind of the coding framework. And what you can see here is that basically for the motivational interviewing behaviors, you're not just coding the presence of them, but you are coding the intensity of them and also the inconsistency of them. So you're coding these different concepts in a very, very comprehensive way. So not just whether they occur at all, but how much did they occur? If we go with adaptation or empathy as one of these, how empathetic were they? And how often were they unempathetic? So were they inconsistent with the model? And then how often were they consistent with the model? And then finally, I'm kind of going to go, and I guess you kind of bounce between table 4 here and figure 1. He coded each of the interviewees basically on where they were in this interpersonal behavioral circle, and critically, if they were showing maladaptive or adaptive patterns of behavior. So, for example, when I said talk about the higher levels, the top of the interpersonal behavioral circle, if you can see my mouse, I'll kind of hover around it now, right? This kind of in charge, setting the agenda, how I would be as a presenter, right? It's a good manifestation. However, there is a negative manifestation of the same behavior, which would be demanding, dogmatic, pedantic, and rigid. So he's coding not just where they are on the circle, but he's also coding if they're doing kind of the good version or the bad version. And he does that for both interviewee and interrogator. And to be honest, I think to really show you this, and I guess this is the joys of being able to do these videos, it might be worth if I give you a live example of how this would look in reality. Okay, so I'm just quickly going to jump over to this video here, and this is a video interrogation of the Florida school shooter, Nicholas Cruz. Now, what we'll do is we'll watch it, and we're only going to watch 45 seconds because it's a quick clip. The entire thing is available online, but this would be done at 15-minute intervals. So to put that in perspective, there's 27 terrorist suspects, I believe, for 288 hours. Instead of doing each interviewee as a line of data, he was A, he was B, what Laurence did is he unpacked each individual interrogation into 15-minute increments. So if you now think that's 288 hours, 4 15-minute increments per hour, that's 288 hours times 4. Mathematically, that's a big number. It's over 1,000. And if anyone would like to do that math quicker than me, you're more than welcome. But basically, so we now have 1,000 data points, and each data point is a moment in time within an interrogation that encapsulates not just our behaviors, right? So the motivational interviewing stuff, the interpersonal behavioral circle stuff, but as I'll show you when we jump back to the paper, a measure of counter-interrogation techniques and or yield. So every 15 minutes, you're coding all of this stuff. So if we were to look at this video here, quick 45 seconds.
What's happened has happened, but now me and you have got to kind of communicate so I can hear you. And again, I'm going to ask you, things about background and things about what happened. Okay, but you gotta relax, and I'll bring you in some water. You sure you don't want something to eat? Okay. 19 years old. Where were you born? What city?
I don't know.
You don't know? Do you know what state?
Florida.
Florida? Have you lived down here your whole life?
Yes.
Okay. But you don't know what city? You don't know what hospital? Okay. All right, so you were definitely born in Florida. Okay, let me go get those waters, and I'll be right back. Okay?
Okay, so looking at that video now, if this were the real data collection process, and let's say hypothetically it was 15 minutes long, what the coder would then do is they'd say, right, okay, let's look at the interviewer's behavior, right? How many of our, motivational interviewing tactics was he using? And if he was using any of them, to what degree was he using them? Was he using them a lot? Was he using them a little? Was he using them a mild amount? Now, obviously, that's not easy to see in 45 seconds, but if you allowed a 15-minute interaction, you'd find that easier. Then the next thing they would do is the exact same thing for the suspect, and then they would move on to the kind of the interpersonal behavioral circumplex stuff, right? So looking at their behaviours, where were they, right? So where was Nicholas Cruz? So if we look at figure 1, he wasn't in, Nicholas Cruz being the perpetrator here, he wasn't in charge setting the agenda, he wasn't social, warm and friendly. No, maybe he was wary, sceptical and reserved, right? So okay, tick that box. He's down there on the circle. Maybe even I wouldn't say he was irritable, distrustful or resentful. So he's okay, he's on the adaptive circle, but he's down low. Okay, what was the interviewer? Well, he wasn't really wary, sceptical and reserved, was he? No, he was more in charge in setting the agenda. Right, tick that box. So in that 15-minute chunk, we've got a metric of where the interviewer was, where the interviewee was, how much they were doing kind of motivational interviewing, how much information was given, and whether any kind of, counter-interrogation or kind of resistance techniques were used. So it's a lot of very complex information in one 15-minute section there. But what you've done is you've quantified and conceptualized both the interaction of the two people in terms of its nature, their behaviors, and also the output that comes from that. And that's how we then get to our, moving down here, kind of our analysis, right? Is this idea of what we're interested in is how do increases in certain behaviors that we hypothesize are good, motivational interviewing, interpersonal behavioral complex, how do increases in those relate to increases in information given? Now, just to give you, if you're interested in understanding this metric of information given, on page 423, halfway down, it basically says this idea of a plat, right? Persons, locations, actions, or things. So if the person says anything about another person involved, a location, an action, i.e. something they did, or things, which I think is the most the more kind of mercurial of them there, then those are the things that are coded to give you a metric of yield. So in the analysis section, and I don't think you need to get bogged down in the analysis section, and when we're looking here at figure 2, this is kind of a structural equational model. What this says in brief is that as motivational interviewing behaviours increase, acceptance, empathy, adaptation, evocation, autonomy, which were defined in the introduction, as they increase, so too does yield. Furthermore, as interviewer adaptive behaviour and interviewee adaptive behaviour, left wheel behaviour, increases, so too does yield, and also motivational interviewing. So those two things are tied. However, critically, as maladaptive behaviour, or from the interviewee or the detainee increases, yield decreases. So what he's shown here is basically that in this large N data set of terrorist offenders, when people engage in certain rapport-based behaviours, the amount of information that they get goes up. And when people are reactive and adaptive in their interpersonal behaviour, the amount of information goes up. And to kind of cut over to the sister paper, if you look at how that works with counter-interrogation techniques, it kind of does the same thing. So good motivational interviewing behaviours decreases the amount of resistance that they try. And if you stay using kind of adaptive, interpersonally reflective, I guess, behaviours, then the amount of resistance tactics decrease. So what is this paper doing? And I think to think about it from a philosophical standpoint, right? So what are the debates that led up to this paper? Well, one of the debates was this idea, and I'll talk about it in the lecture, but this idea that rapport was going soft, and critically that rapport works, with low-level criminals, or rapport works with, witnesses, but rapport doesn't work when it comes to those hardened terrorists. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed isn't going to tell you everything just because you're nice to him. Well, maybe, but he definitely didn't say anything because you were horrible to him. So, what this does is it says, okay, well, that doesn't fly anymore. Because in a data set of actual interrogations with actual terrorist suspects from the IRA, and they're hardened, to Al-Qaeda, to extreme right-wing, these hardened terrorists who were willing and or did actually, kill and harm, they were more responsive when you used rapport-based behaviours. So that's the kind of the first message, right? And there's a follow-on paper from this that's it doesn't have any data. It's a more theoretical piece, and basically it's kind of it's about kind of, just basically rapport as a concept is evidenced as working even with these, high value targets, if you will. And if you read any of the FBI follow-on reports from this, they all come to that same conclusion. The second point of this paper is the way in which it conceptualizes what rapport is. And that is the idea that rapport is not a tactic nor a tool in a toolkit. Rapport is a enduring kind of psychological relationship that is based on the adoption of motivational interviewing perspective. So the idea that the detainee, has control and autonomy, and you can't just change the environment into it. And also the idea that you need to match your approach and your behavior to that of your interviewee in order to have the best opportunity for rapport. So when you take those two things together, it's not just about the fact that a paper found this. It's about that the first paper to look at real data with real terrorists found that a rapport-based strategy was the best way to get information from them, which at the time flies in the face of all of the narratives around the need to be more, and not just enhanced interrogation techniques here, more confrontational in your approach, more aggressive in your approach, which, you've seen. And if anyone's ever watched Hawaii 5-0 and an interrogation in Hawaii 5-0 when Steve McLean or whatever it is throws a chair and ties them to it, like ridiculous, like that just doesn't work. Right, that's that tough tactics fail part of the title there. So this paper is the first kind of in the package, and I think this was 2013. It could be 2014. 7 years ago now. But since then, these findings have been nothing but replicated. Nuances have emerged, but nothing but replicated. And still to this day, and you saw it cited in the Shane O'Mara piece, this is still the only research team who has access to real interrogations with real terrorist offenders. And so that's why, to me, from a methodological standpoint, this paper is so important, because it was the first one that was able to go to the source and then to quantify something as complex as an interaction into a framework that allowed measurements of inputs and outputs, cause and effect, separated in time and space. And so the methodology here, to me, is one of the most important parts of the piece. So I really hope you enjoyed this paper. It's a fantastic read, and it's a fantastic concept, and it's a very good, if you think about it from a philosophical or almost strategic standpoint, it's a really excellent way of showing how, even with something like an interrogation, it can be studied properly, and we don't have to settle with the tropes of either, well, we can't analyse it because it occurs, in the fog of war, or, well, the only way we can really exert control here and measure things is if we strip it right down to its composite parts and just throw some students at the problem. I think that there are truths in all of them, but what this shows is that kind of that practitioner academic meeting in the middle of real data, but in no way shirking on kind of the theory, the analysis, the conceptualization, and the complexity. So I hope you really enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed this paper, and I hope that you enjoyed this week as a whole, because I think it will be a really interesting way to kind of show how science can work, even in kind of very, very complex areas. So enjoy. I look forward to recording one of these next week, and I hope you're having fun. Goodbye.